today we're going to delve into the birth of an American republic. Let's look at the 13 English colonies. The colonies are depicted in color on the map here. Now, colony defined. A colony is a group of immigrants or their descendants who settle in a distant territory but remain subject to the parent country. In this case, the mother country was Britain. The 13 colonies began to flourish, and cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were becoming centers of trade and revenue. Now, Britain began to use a policy called mercantilism, which we studied in previous lessons, which brought with it the Navigation Acts. Basically, Parliament was trying to find a solution to the rapidly growing Dutch trade, and the Dutch were their competitors, so they're trying to kind of cut them out, at least where the colonies are concerned. So a series of laws were passed under the Acts, the Navigation Acts, from 1651 until 1696, so that's over 40 years. And under the provisions of the Acts, trade with the colonies could only be conducted in English or colonial ships. So the colonies could not trade with the Dutch, for example. They could only trade with England or its colonies. Now, particular items such as sugar, tobacco, and indigo were to be shipped only within the empire, the British Empire. If any of these particular items needed to go outside of the empire, it would first have to go to England. Britain did not do an excellent job of enforcing these laws, however. Now, back to the colonies. Slowly, the colonies began to become more diverse. Most of the settlers were English, but there were also Dutch, Swedes, Germans, French, and Spanish in some areas. And in 1690, the American population had risen to about 250,000 people. From that point on, it doubled every 25 years until in 1775 it numbered more than 2.5 million people. So now we're a nation of 300 million people, if that gives you any vantage point of comparison. Now, a family could move from Massachusetts to Virginia or from South Carolina to Pennsylvania without any major readjustment, because that all fell under British dominion, really. However, there were still distinctions between the individual colonies. Let's talk about growing discontent. As the settlers continued to live under the rule of the English king, King George III, they became increasingly frustrated with his policies. The British could sense that the colonists were yearning for independence. And unfortunately, the British tried to take more control of the colonists. During the mid-1770s, King George III and the government of Britain forced heavy taxes of everyday items on the colonists. And these taxes made it difficult for the colonists to buy basic goods, such as tea. Many of the colonists began to demand no taxation without representation and boycotted to buy British goods. The taxation without representation just means that they didn't have a voice in the British Parliament. So they felt, if we don't have a voice, why should we be taxed? We have no stake in the legislative process. So, right here is a cartoon that depicts the no taxation without representation phrase. And the cartoon shows that the colonists are upset that they're being taxed on sugar, tea, and stamps, but had no representation at all in the British government. So, like I said, no taxation without representation is a common slogan of the time. Now, a variety of events occurred in Boston, and some of them you have probably heard about. Clashes began to erupt in the colonies, beginning with the shooting death of 5 colonists called the Boston Massacre. In 1773, the infamous Boston Tea Party occurred, a group of men acting as the Sons of Liberty went to Boston Harbor and dumped 45 tons of tea into the Boston Harbor. This signified the colonists' growing frustration with the British government. The colonies were once again demanding that the British government remove tax on tea. So here's an engraving of the Boston Massacre by Paul Revere, and it was sold widely throughout the colonies. Now, resentment was fermenting in the colonies and growing against British rule, causing the Revolutionary War to break out in 1775. Thomas Jefferson summarized the colonists' views in the Declaration of Independence. His words inspired many colonists to fight. Now, let's look at the American Revolution and some of the alliances that formed. During the American Revolution, the colonists were divided into the Loyalists who supported Britain or the Patriots who demanded independence. The colonies that sought independence had difficulty finding the financial resources to support the war. In 1777, the Americans were able to secure a pivotal victory in Saratoga, which greatly boosted morale. Alliances were created, which aided the colonist cause. The last battle of the war was at Yorktown, and the Patriots were victorious. 3 years later, the Treaty of Paris was signed, recognizing America's independence and setting new boundaries for the freshly independent nation. So on this slide, we see the major battles that occurred in the Revolutionary War. And this is available as slides, so you can read through them slowly. So if you look at these slides, can you think of the battles that were fought in Pennsylvania? Because there's at least one major battle that occurred in Pennsylvania. So, of course, now we want our independence. We need a constitution to solidify the government and kind of define how it will operate. The Constitution of the United States is considered to be a flexible document, meaning that it can change with time. It was influenced by the ideas of Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. So remember these figures from the Enlightenment. It created a republic, which would separate the power between the federal and state governments. And it included the first 10 amendments, called the Bill of Rights. This Constitution was ratified in 1788 and is still today the highest law of the land. So let's just go over some key points. Conflict between the colonists and Britain increased after 1763 because the colonists resented the new taxes that Britain imposed to help pay for the French and Indian War. They opposed the taxes because they had no representation in Parliament. Enlightenment ideas were reflected on the Declaration of Independence by claiming that all men are born with rights that governments must protect. Moreover, Enlightenment ideas were reflected on the Constitution because it was based on the social contract theory of government. It created a government with power divided among 3 branches, just as Montesquieu recommended. And during the mid-1770s, Britain controlled trade in the colonies, while politics and society were generally controlled by wealthy landowners. Religious and social diversity, however, helped reduce the types of social distinctions that were found in Europe. So, that's about it. And once again, the slides are available for you to view.